Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Andrew Brankley and welcome to this video. Does STABLE-2007 work? A meta-analysis. The content of this video is based on an article we published in the journal Sexual Abuse. In it, you can find all the content discussed in this video, plus more. A link to the article can be found below in the description section of this video. It took a team to make this video, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Drs. Babchishan and Hansen. It is also appropriate to note for potential conflicts of interest that Dr. Hansen is the lead author of STABLE-2007 and head of the development team, of which I am also a part. Also, we have all published research on STABLE-2007. I would also like to thank the following people for sharing their data and answering questions related to their research on STABLE-2007. Their support not only made the study possible, but it also highlights the wonderful spirit of collaboration within our field. Thank you all. Over the years, more and more assessment tools have been made to measure risk for sexual offending. This creates a challenge for researchers and professionals when selecting tools for their use. The last thing you would want is to find out that there isn't much evidence supporting a tool after you started using it. Just like you don't want to find out that a string of gruesome murders were committed in your house after you bought it.
But don't get me wrong, it's a great house. It's a fantastic, got really good bones.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mean structurally, right? Not like there's bones in here someplace.
Sure, Vanessa. Let's say that's what I meant.
So, how do you go about picking your assessment tools? One approach is to think about what you are measuring. I go into this topic in greater detail in my video, What is Risk? But basically, when we are assessing someone for risk, we want to understand the psychological factors that contributed to their sexual crimes. We go about measuring these factors in multiple ways. We usually start with measures that make use of easily accessible information that often does not require meeting the individual. This preliminary information can be optimized by conducting clinical interviews, speaking with friends or family members, or integrating treatment information. Routine observations from weekly meetings, for example, can further refine our understanding of risk. As a result, we have 3 different information sources for the same risk factors. This breakdown maps onto the static, stable, and acute tools, as well as many other tools currently used. Currently, a great deal of information exists about tools making use of the first source of information, so-called static tools. In this video, we are going to focus on measures that are often revered for more straightforward clinical and management applications, the so-called stable dynamic risk tools. Our colleagues from the Netherlands recently published an article where they asked if these so-called dynamic tools are actually predictive of reoffending and if they add useful information to static tools. They included data from a wide variety of tools and methods for measuring risk from dynamic information sources. They found support for their hypotheses. An interesting note is that there was some inconsistency in how the tools predicted recidivism, which leads to the next logical question. Do all tools work equally well? Probably not, and if not, then which tools should you use? To answer these questions, we need to evaluate each tool individually. This study examines STABLE-2007. We had 3 hypotheses. That STABLE would predict recidivism, in particular sexual recidivism, as that is the primary focus of the tool. STABLE would provide novel information to static 99R. And lastly, that STABLE items themselves predict sexual recidivism. Before we begin, let's just briefly describe what a meta-analysis is for the folks who are less familiar with it. Individual studies on predictive accuracy give individual results. Some have significant findings, others have non-significant findings. A meta-analysis is one way of figuring out the general trend in the literature. It takes all relevant studies, regardless of whether they found significant results or not, and then averages them in a particular way. It does so by weighting the studies based upon the amount of error or variability present within each set of results. This provides us with an overall result. A super result, if you will. I mean, no one has ever called it that, but it could catch on. A result that we can use to determine the use of a tool. We began our meta-analysis by searching the usual sources of information, including unpublished or gray literature like dissertations and theses. We even asked Dr. Hansen if he was aware of other studies or evaluations that had stable and recidivism data. This provided us with 21 studies on STABLE-2007's predictive validity. These studies, however, represented 12 unique or different samples. In other words, some samples contributed to more than one study. Almost 7,000 people were represented in this meta-analysis, coming from across the world, including Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria. And it's great to see some of the diversity in Stable's application because we can't forget that some countries do not always get along.
CIA.
Interpol! What is the CIA doing here? This is my jurisdiction. Not to mention my badge is bigger.
One of the stolen paintings was on loan from the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this is CIA jurisdiction. Also, this is my travel badge. Here's my real badge.
Oh, you must have been looking at the wrong badge.
You won this round, Pierre.
My name is Jean.
Okay, Sean.
Thankfully, researchers are usually better at getting along. So, let's describe the samples. This figure is going to give you 3 pieces of information. Sample type will be shown by the color of circles on the screen. The differences are ordinal, ranging on preselection of risk. Routine samples, green, means no preselection, meaning that the samples are as representative as possible. Treatment samples, orange, are samples preselected by some formal or informal process for treatment. And high-risk, high-need samples, red, which represent a minority of the total population that is the highest risk for reoffending. Ideally, less than 20% of the routine samples. We also had to include an other category, purple, for a sample that was higher risk than treatment, but was noticeably higher in the 20% heuristic for representation in high-risk, high-need samples. The placement of circles along the x-axis relates to their mean STABLE-2007 score, and static 99R score along the y-axis. Lastly, the size of the circle is directly proportional to study weight in the meta-analysis. The bigger the circle, the less variability in that sample, and the more information from that study contributed to the overall estimate. Variability is reduced when studies have larger sample sizes or when there are more consistent findings across participants in a study. So let's begin with the 4 routine samples. As expected, these cluster around the traditional mean scores of 7 on Stable and a 2 on static 99R. For interest's sake, the second largest circle is the Stable development sample. 2 samples were of participants who were preselected for sex offense-specific treatment. Interestingly, neither sample was particularly high on static 99R, but both were higher than routine samples on Stable. This contributes to the idea of STABLE-2007 collecting novel information. The other sample was a bit higher than the previous 2 sample types on both measures. Mean scores from the high-risk, high-need samples clustered high on both static and Stable. The relationship between sample type and static Stable scores is somewhat linear. Now, this on its own is an interesting finding and could be useful for static 99R users in selecting the appropriate reference sample. Now, I won't go into details on that issue now, But interested listeners can look for guidance on page 19 of the article where our recommendations are provided. Before answering questions about predictive validity, we thought it was worthwhile to consider the reliability of STABLE-2007 scoring, as reliability is a prerequisite for validity. Reliability was expressed in terms of intra-class correlation coefficients, or ICCs, which are expressed from 0 to 100 and can be interpreted using the following guidelines. 4 of the 12 studies had information for reliability. The total scores from 3 of the studies clustered high in the excellent range. 2 of the studies used a mixture of archival and prospective approaches to code stable, while the other study relied purely on archival information. Reliability in the 4th study fell in the unacceptable range. This was initially disappointing, as the other studies were doing so well.
Oh my God, can you just be cool? Once, please. Just once. Can you just once be cool? Once. Please.
But we quickly regained our objectivity. This study used archival data, and so this finding may emphasize the difficulty of obtaining reliable ratings using file information only. The median of the 4 studies was in the excellent range, meaning that there's good reason for us to progress in our evaluation of Stable's predictive validity. Over the years, recidivism has been analyzed in different ways. Correlations and group comparisons were more commonly used in the beginning, with the AUC and odds ratio metrics being used more recently. Odds ratios are usually preferred to AUCs because they are less influenced by the variability in the predictor or outcome. They also provide estimates of relative risk and absolute risk. Hazard ratios were preferred in this review over odds ratios because they also incorporate length of follow-up as a parameter. As a result, hazard ratios differ from odds ratios in that odds ratios are cumulative over an entire study using whatever start and end point was determined in that study. Hazard ratios represent instantaneous risk over the study time period, or subset, and therefore suffer somewhat less from selection bias with respect to the endpoints chosen. They can also indicate risks that happen before the endpoint. This figure is going to contain hazard ratios from the 12 studies. Across the x-axis, I have labeled hazard ratios from 0.8 to 1.8. If the effect size estimate from a study is 1.1, that means each point on the stable is equivalent to an increase of 10% hazard over the base rate of 1, and so on. Admittedly, hazard ratios are not the most intuitive to understand. The base rate hazard of 1 is important to remember because values whose confidence intervals overlap with 1 are not significant. The 12 studies are represented by the rows of the figure. I have also provided the follow-up time ranging from 2 to 14 years. Rate of sexual recidivism from each study is also given as a count and as a percentage of the total sample. Here are the effect sizes. As you can see, many of them were not significant, so it's not immediately obvious what the result is. So, are you ready to see the results of the meta-analysis?
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it!
Okay, yeesh. The multicolored diamond at the bottom of the screen is the overall effect size. The confidence intervals are barely visible at either side of the diamond. There was no difference between the fixed and random effects meta-analysis. I have colored the diamonds from each study using the same sample type color scheme from before. Just from eyeballing the estimates, there doesn't seem to be a relationship between effect sizes and amount of pre-selection. In fact, almost half the estimates are clustered within a couple hundredths of a decimal place, again with contributions from all sample types. This is a remarkably high degree of consistency. We can also compare estimates that came from our team's studies or from individuals who were not at all involved in the development of Stable. The development team's estimates do not appear as outliers, but rank in the middle of the different effect sizes. An interesting finding, to be sure.
Dear STABLE-2007 users, we are anonymous. And definitely not Andrew playing around with a voice modulator. He. Him. We have hijacked this video because it is time you know the truth. You are working in a world controlled by a network of elite researchers fascinated by their fancy statistics. Statistics not always accessible to the average user. I mean, hazard ratios, instantaneous hazards. Come on, what a headache. We have broken into Andrew's computer and obtained the data from his meta-analysis to perform our own analyses using area under the curve as the effect size. Using raw follow-up time, the result was a significant AUC of 0.674, with fairly narrow confidence intervals. In other words, there is about a 67% chance the recidivist would obtain a higher score on STABLE-2007 than a non-recidivist. Dear STABLE-2007 users, we hope our analyses give you some confidence and that you continue to conduct research on this tool and use it in applied practice. Good luck.
Don't you agree? This evidence supports the predictive validity of Stable with sexual recidivism. But what about the other types of recidivism? I like thinking about three important distinctions: sexual, violent, and non-violent. First, we have sexual crime. This includes all criminal behavior that has a sexual motivation, regardless of whether the word sex or a related word like incest is in the title. Violent crime is more common than sexual crime, hence the bigger circle, and describes all criminal behavior that involves real or perceived threat or harm to a person. There is an obvious overlap between violent and sexual crime. Some sexual crime is also violent, like a sexual assault. However, there is also sexual crime where there is no intentional contact or attempt to make the individual aware they were being victimized. Example, possessing child sexual exploitation materials or voyeurism. For these purposes, all nonviolent crime is lumped together in the gray area. The big circle would thus include all behavior that is criminal in nature. At the same time we look at other types of recidivism, we are also going to look at the incremental effect of Stable. Under each recidivism type is a row for the Stable direct effect, that is Stable predicting the outcome on its own, and the indirect effect, or in other words, the effect Stable has in predicting that outcome over and above static 99R. The second column has a count of the recidivists and the total sample. And the third column has a new statistic used in meta-analysis called the I-squared. The I-squared indicated how much variability, or noise, there is in a meta-analysis. Less variability is good. A fairly clear pattern emerges. The direct effects are understandably a bit stronger than the indirect effects. However, all are significant. The I-squared was within tolerable ranges except for the direct effect in any crime. No significant outliers were identified. In our meta-analysis, Stable predicted all types of recidivism and was incremental to static 99R. But hold on, is that it? Should everyone just be convinced that Stable works?
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Indeed. Before we move on to analyzing items, let's stop and look at the factors that potentially moderate the predictive accuracy of STABLE-2007. We examined 3 factors: whether or not the study was published, sample type, and because there were so many Canadian studies, we compared them with studies produced outside of Canada. The effect sizes in the figure are for STABLE-2007's direct effect predicting sexual recidivism. The third column, P, tells you if there were any significant differences between the 2 groups. There were none. With further research, we will have a sufficiently large selection of studies to examine further moderators. So let's move on to examining stable items. The validity of the items are important because although different tools are measuring the same underlying constructs, tools like Stable do so in a way that is intuitively applicable in case management. We meta-analyze stable items using the available data. Each row will represent the aggregate meta-analytic effect for that item. All items significantly predicted sexual recidivism on their own. Although there is some variability in predictive strength between items, all items seem to work about the same. 2 items, general social rejection and loneliness, and poor cognitive problem solving, had significant variability amongst the studies. No outliers were present. Another interesting observation is that all but one of the 6 items with slightly bigger effect sizes were related to general criminality. In other words, the general psychological causes of crime are still very relevant to understanding sexual crime. Although we have addressed the 3 hypotheses that we set out at the beginning, I am sure listeners still have more questions, like, does stable work better in some subpopulations than others? Or do the items predict other types of recidivism? Now that we have the 12 data sets, we have a golden treasure that can be used to answer these further questions.
So, well, gentlemen, I guess that just about wraps it up.
Where is the Ark?
I thought we'd settled that. The Ark is somewhere very safe. From whom?
The Ark is a source of unspeakable power, and it has to be researched.
And it will be, I assure you, Dr. Brody, Dr. Jones. We have top men working on it right now. Who? Top men.
Just kidding. We aren't filing away these data sets. There are too many interesting questions left to answer. On behalf of the authors, I hope this information was helpful in summarizing the predictive validity of STABLE-2007 so that you can make informed choices about how you measure risk. Please feel free to share this video for training or teaching purposes. I am happy for you to use the video or the slides themselves in your own presentations. I just ask that you leave the slide intact and reference it accordingly. Also, feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments. If you liked this video, then I hope you check out my other videos and subscribe to my YouTube channel.